Well, we have an interesting story for you today. A woman who was born and raised in Vancouver, but who led a life that would be shocking to most Canadians. Instead of me telling you about it, let's ask the young woman herself. She joins us now via Skype from Vancouver, Yasmine Mohammed. Nice to meet you. Thanks for being with us today. I'd like to talk with you about your life story because it's a political story, but it's first off a personal story. You are from a Muslim family. Your parents came to Vancouver from San Francisco. Your mother divorced your father when she was pregnant with you, if I'm not mistaken. And so tell us the story from there on. So you're born in Vancouver. You have a single mom who's Muslim. Tell us what she did and how that changed your life forever.
All right, so as you say, she was in Vancouver and she now had 3 kids. I was the third child, and my parents got divorced, and she was all alone in Vancouver. She just moved here. She didn't know anybody, and she's an immigrant from Egypt anyway, so she had a hard time fitting in San Francisco, but coming to Vancouver was even harder because she was completely it was a new city for her. So she gravitated, unfortunately, to the mosque because that's where she was looking for community and support. She grew up in a pretty, it was Muslim, but she was totally relaxed, secular Muslim family. She went to Catholic schools growing up. Her best friend was Christian. There were no issues. But when she went to the mosque looking for support, unfortunately, the people that found her and supported her were fundamentalist Muslims, and they led her down that path, and she ended up becoming the second concurrent wife to an Egyptian man who was already married to a Canadian convert. She's French-Canadian. She converted to Islam, married him, and then my mom was his second wife. And
so
eventually...
This was in Canada. So your mom became...
All in Canada.
So... with the full knowledge, I presume, of the mosque, your mom joined, really, it was bigamy or polygamy, and everyone in the mosque knew this, and this was just fine and normal in Vancouver.
Oh, it happens all the time. So what happens is the man will be married to one woman legally, and then he will be married to the other women Islamically. So obviously he can't marry them. My mom was not his legal wife. And so that's how they're able to get away with it.
Now, this man, obviously, he's living the fundamentalist lifestyle with multiple wives. You say your mom was pretty easygoing, secular, liberal. How was her life transformed by her new fundamentalist Muslim husband in Canada?
Completely transformed. So it was a complete change in our lives. All of a sudden, everything was haram, which means forbidden. Music was haram, riding bikes was haram, having friends that were non-Muslim was haram. My mom had to start covering her hair. We had to start reading this foreign language from this book and praying, and all of this stuff was completely foreign and new, and I fought against it, of course. I was unhappy about it. I was told that birthdays were haram, and for any little kid, to tell them you're not allowed to have birthday parties anymore. Of course I'm going to hate this thing that has invaded my life. Plus he was, an abusive man, so that didn't help either. He was physically, emotionally, every kind of abuse you can imagine. He was abusive towards us as the children, and towards my mom and his wife as well. So it was a complete change. I was very unhappy about it. I fought against it for the longest time, but then we ended up going to Islamic schools when I was 9 years old, and that's when the fighting stopped, because then you're completely immersed in it, and there's no reprieve. There's nothing. What does a 9-year-old have to fight with? Nothing.
Now, I was reading your story on the website of Ayan Hirsi Ali, the AHA Foundation, and you mentioned that you had appeared before social workers, even before the law, and it's your belief that the way you and your mother and your family were treated, the abuse, including physical abuse, that it, had you been a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Christian girl, it would not have been tolerated. The abuser would have been charged with assault or whatnot. But because you were Muslim, the law, the regulations, the society, the social workers, all the establishment is what I mean. They said, well, that's their cultural custom, and so they turned a blind eye to it. They had a lower standard for intervention because they said, well, they're Muslim. Is that an accurate statement of your views?
That's exactly what the judge said to me. So that's precisely what the judge had said, is he said that this is the way my family's culture chooses to discipline us, and that is within their right, and he has no right to tell them that the way that they're disciplining their child is not right. He felt like that wasn't his place. So yeah, essentially that's what I was hearing. I was hearing, if you were just a girl from a Swedish or German or Scottish background, then we would expect your parents to treat you like a human being. But since you come from a culture where children are regularly physically abused and it's part of their culture, then I'm sorry, you're just going to have to endure that. Yeah. And I felt really betrayed by my country. I fell into a depression for many years after that because I really thought that I was going to get myself out.
Now, as you grew up, I read your story on the Ayaan Hirsi Ali Foundation website. I read that you had more and more disagreements with your mother, and then finally you were set up in an arranged marriage. Tell me with whom and what was he like? Was he Canadian? How was that arranged? How old was he? How old were you?
So yeah, you're exactly right. We just kept on fighting, and eventually I just gave in and I accepted this marriage that she was pushing on me. I was 19 years old at the time when I entered into the Islamic marriage with him. We were legally married about a year after that. And in that time, he barely spoke English. My job was to teach him English. I had been living in Egypt for 2 years prior to that, so I was fluent in Arabic. The reason why I was in Egypt was because that was a last-ditch effort. My mom just sort of took us to Egypt and left me there in the hopes that being in an Islamic country, I would straighten out. But that didn't work. I came back to Canada and fighting continued, and that's when she forced me into this marriage where my choices were marry him or you're out in the street and you're not my daughter and don't come to my funeral, and all of the emotional blackmail that comes with the forced marriage, which is a very typical experience for many girls from Islamic backgrounds. And I was married to him. I ended up getting pregnant. I had a little daughter. We were living together for a while, and he wasn't home, but my mom was home with me, and she just started to bleed from her nose and her mouth simultaneously. And so I started to panic, and I called 911, and an ambulance came. And I hesitated because I'd never left the house without him before, and I wasn't sure if I should. I was scared to, but then I figured, he should be okay with the fact that I'm going to the ambulance or going to the hospital with my mom in an ambulance. Hopefully that's a good enough reason to leave the house without him.
So you had never
So that was my very first time.
You'd never been out of the house without your husband's guardianship. It sounds more like Saudi Arabia or Iran than Canada.
Oh, absolutely. And I was covered head to toe in black if I ever did leave the house. And really it was only for prenatal appointments because it was once a month basically to see the doctor. Women don't leave the house unless it's for emergency purposes. We had curtains on all our windows, but then he also used like the brown meatpacking paper to tape the windows down as well, just in case the curtains moved and anybody could see from behind the curtains. I was up on the 17th floor when the first time he punched me in the face because the curtains were open and my hair was uncovered, and he was afraid that people would see me and started calling me a whore. So that was the first time he hit me. So my mom was bleeding. I went to the hospital with her for the very first time, left the house without him, and it felt like within minutes. I mean, it was a very traumatic, stressful time, but it felt like almost immediately I was approached by a man and a woman, and they told me they were from CSIS, and I had no idea what CSIS were. I thought that they were doctors. I thought that they were there to talk to you about my mom. Then they explained to me it was like the Canadian CIA, which I had no idea we even had such a thing. And then they started to tell me who I was married to, and that he was a member of Al-Qaeda, and he was an Egyptian man that had come to Canada from Afghanistan with a fake Saudi Arabian passport. Those were a lot of red flags. They learned that when he first came to Canada, of course, he was detained initially, and then he was bailed out. A lawyer was paid for him, and that lawyer helped him to get refugee status, and they learned that the person that paid for the lawyer was Osama bin Laden.
Oh my God.
And this is pre 9/11, so these things didn't really mean as much to me as they did later when I started to know who these characters were. And of course, time passed, and eventually he ended up in prison in Egypt, and he was sentenced to 15 years hard labor. And in that whole court case before he was sentenced in Egypt, all of this stuff came out about him, and all of the things that he was involved in, like U.S. embassy bombings in Africa and stuff like that. I didn't even realize the extent. I knew he was a horrible man to me, but I didn't realize actually how involved he was as a jihadi.
Well, what was he doing in Canada? I mean, I understand why your mom and dad moved to Canada, and I also understand, finding a fundamentalist polygamist at the mosque. But it sounds like your husband was an Al-Qaeda activist if he was paid for indirectly through that lawyer by Osama bin Laden. What was his mission? Did you ever learn what was he doing in Canada? Was he there to recruit? Was he there to do reconnaissance? Why was he in our country?
He was here for 9/11. So I grew up in White Rock, which is very close to the U.S. border. And back in those days, you could cross the border from Canada to the States very easily. You wouldn't even need a driver's license sometimes. You would just say, yeah, I'm going down to Bellingham to, whatever for the day. And so it was very easy to cross the border. It was much easier to come into Canada and to get refugee status and then to cross the border that way than it was for him to try to get into the States. Would have been very difficult, especially since the FBI were already on to him. So that's why he was in Canada.
That's incredible.
So that's why he chose that specific area.
Now, he was arrested, tried, imprisoned in Egypt. How did you break away not just from him, but from the family, from the mosque, from the whole oppressive culture? I mean, you told me you grew up in a liberal manner. I remember I read your story on the Ayaan Hirsi Ali Foundation website of how shocked you were when your records were smashed by your mom's husband. How did you decide to break away, not just from that man, but from that whole subculture that you had been trapped in, really imprisoned in a way, in your own apartment? How did you get out?
Well, it was a very slow process. Initially, I did not leave the house. I was afraid, even though I had a restraining order, I was too scared to leave the house because I didn't know where he was. But I stayed in constant contact with CSIS, and eventually they showed me pictures of him behind bars in Egypt. So that's when I felt confident to leave my house. And the first thing I did was apply for student loans to go to university. And I started to go to UBC, and it was, my mom had left to go visit my sister in Florida, and I took my daughter and I packed some bags, and I left while she was gone. And I rented a basement apartment and started going to university, and all this time I was still identifying as Muslim. I had a very difficult relationship with my mom again. I mean, it had been difficult my whole life, but of course now she's trying to force me into the next marriage, and there was no way I was going to do that again. I said, no, I'd rather be on my own. I'm not scared of being on my own like I was the first time. And of course, girls don't live on their own. Good Muslim girls go from their parents' house to their husband's house. Only whores live on their own. So she was very upset about that. Not only was I a divorced woman, but now I was living on my own. So I was a complete embarrassment to the family and to the community, because my mother was the head of the Islamic Studies department at the Islamic school here. So, you know, it was very embarrassing for her to have such a daughter. And when I started going to university, I just happened to choose an elective called History of Religions, not thinking that it would completely change the trajectory of my life. I just thought, oh, I know at least a third of this curriculum really well, because it's about the three monotheistic Abrahamic religions, and I've been immersed in, my mother was a student at Al-Azhar University, and so, and like I said, head of the Islamic Studies department, and as her daughter, I had to know this stuff well, because it was, it was her reputation on the line. So I took that course, and the professor that taught the course was a Lebanese Christian. So he knew the Arab background, and he understood the Islamic background too. And it was really eye-opening for me. It was the first time that I had ever looked at Islam from an objective point of view. I had always been raised to believe that it was completely, the Quran, the book, was so divine and different than anything else in this world. And, you have to do a certain wash yourself in a specific way before you touch this book, and it's never to touch the ground. And there's all these rules around this divine book, which is the literal word of God, from God's mouth written into this book. And when I started to take this course, and I started to learn that a lot of these stories were just plagiarized from Christianity and from Judaism and from pagan stories before that even, and it took all that divinity away, and I started to realize that I had been fed a lie. And it was just like this weird, simultaneously feeling really happy that I don't have to follow this anymore, that it was all a scam, but at the same time really, really scared, because what else do I have? Who else am I? This is all I've ever known. And so it was a very slow process of going through, basically rebuilding myself brick by brick. It was
Wow. Now,
it was a long process.
I mean, from Al-Qaeda to atheism is the name of your book. So, would you call yourself an ex-Muslim now? Are you an ex-Muslim activist? How did you get connected with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, another famous ex-Muslim? And by the way, the penalty for renouncing Islam, which is called apostasy, the penalty for that under Islam is death, isn't it? Have you received any threats for leaving Islam? Are you in contact with your old mosque or your old family?
Well, the first person to threaten me was my mom, but she actually didn't know that I had left Islam. She just saw me without the hijab on, because when I was going through my process, the first thing I did was take off the hijab, and she said, if you're taking off your hijab, your next step is to leave the religion, and I'll make sure to kill you before that happens, because I'm not risking my own soul, because it's her responsibility to raise a good Muslim daughter, and if she doesn't do that, then she could, suffer the wrath of Allah. So she promised to make sure that didn't happen, to make sure that she wasn't going to risk her own life. So she, as had been threatened to me many times before growing up, this was in the days before Facebook or Twitter or any social media, so they could say something like, oh, she's gone back to Egypt, and then as far as anybody knows, that's it. Meanwhile, you're buried in the backyard or whatever. And these are not empty threats. I mean, in Canada alone, we know about Aksat Parvez, we know about the Shafia sisters, and that's just in Canada. There's, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of examples from the Muslim world and from across the Western world as well. I myself had a friend that just disappeared, and we were told that she had moved to her family's home in Fiji, but we just never heard from her again. But anyway, this was different. This was not like threatening to keep kids in line, although all those threats really worked too. This was serious. I had moved out now. I'd been divorced. I was taking off a hijab. Like, my mom felt like I was totally out of her control, and she needed to control the situation. So yeah, it's the natural first response when somebody says they're going to leave the religion. You get told, you realize that the punishment for that is to be killed. And in 13 countries across the planet, that actually is the legal punishment for leaving Islam. Yeah. So I'm lucky that I'm in Canada, because it's not legal to execute me here for leaving my religion.
Yasmine, this is a fascinating story, and I would like to talk to you at much greater length, but I want to be respectful of your time today. I want to come to where you are in 2018, because you're affiliated with Ayan Hirsi. And by the way, it takes great courage when you feel so alone to stand up against those closest to you, your mother, your husband, your mosque, your community. I can only imagine what it must have felt like, and so all alone. And as you say, when the judge and the law itself turns its back on you because you're just a Muslim girl. So I salute you for that. And I would like to have you on further occasions to talk with you about these things. But for the remaining minutes that we have today, let's fast forward to today. What a fascinating story you've gone through, a story of courage. What do you do now? Because Ayan Hirsi Ali is a voice for ex-Muslims, a voice critical of Islam and the jihad, and she's very courageous and public about it. But it's hard. She's always under threat. I met her once, and she had a whole security detail. There was probably 4 officers with her. She had to leave Holland because she was under such real threat of assassination. What's your life now? What do you do with your time? Are you active with her foundation? What do you do?
Yes, I am active with her foundation. In fact, I'll be going to speak for her foundation in Harvard this month and in Stanford next month. Like you, I have nothing but respect and admiration for Ayan Hirsi Ali. What she is doing is by far more difficult than what I'm doing, because of course, you know the story of how a death threat to her was stabbed into the body of Van Gogh. So, of Theo Van Gogh, who she directed a movie with. So she is definitely under much higher risk than I am. I'm not nearly, obviously, as known as she is. So but before I spoke up for the very first time, I had to make peace with, and I had to understand that there was the potential that could be a possibility, that I would one day could potentially have to live with security, and something could happen, and I had to know, I had to be okay with that before I spoke out for the first time. And I say it's kind of ironic, but Islam always teaches good Muslims to not be afraid of death and to always stand up for what they believe. And that's always what I've been taught. And now that is actually being used against the religion, unfortunately, for them. But I was quiet for many years, just living my life, doing my thing. I mean, I had no reason to speak out against this religion or against what they're doing to other Muslims. I didn't feel like I felt like this was my own personal story. I didn't know that there were so many people that were going to relate to what I had gone through. But it really all started with Sam Harris when he was on the Bill Maher show with Ben Affleck. And Sam Harris was speaking about Islam in the same way that I would, and he was being, rational and making total sense. And him and Bill Maher were talking about Islam in the same way that they would both talk about Christianity. And all of a sudden, Ben Affleck was calling them gross and racist. And that's when I decided that I had to speak out and tell my story, because everybody in my life was congratulating Ben Affleck and thinking that Sam Harris was indeed gross and racist. And I realized, wow, people are so misinformed. People really have no clue what's going on. And so I felt it was my responsibility.
They're afraid of being called Islamophobes. Well, Yasmine, this is a fascinating interview, and I just, in the interest of time, we have to wrap it up here, but I look forward to part 2 with you, where we continue the conversation. I feel like you've set the table for your background and what you went through to bring you to where you are today. In future conversations, and I hope you will come back, we can talk about the fight for ex-Muslims who I think are invisible in the media. I think we can talk about Islam in Canada. We can talk about anti-Islamophobia motions and laws. And there's so much to talk about, but I feel like our viewers now really have a good biography of who you are for our future conversations.
Great. Thank you so much, Ezra. I look forward to coming on again.
Well, thank you so much. What a pleasure and an honor to meet with you. And we will certainly have you back. And once again, I salute you for your courage and for telling a very traumatic story, but it's what's made you who you are. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
All right, there you have it. Yasmine Mohammed with the Ayaan Hirsi Ali Foundation, and her book is From Al-Qaeda to Atheism. That's an excerpt from my daily TV show, The Ezra Levant Show. Normally it's behind a paywall, but I thought you'd like this video, so we put it on YouTube. If you want to subscribe to watch the daily show every day, including always 2 interviews a day, and I read my hate mail, just click on this screen and become a premium member.